What I think the church has not done is ask the hard question: what is it about our Christian faith that would give us a different answer than we're seeing out the rest of the world? Or does our Christian faith give us a different answer? Is there something about our Christian faith that can give us insight that others are lacking? And we not ask those hard questions, and therefore we adopt the answers of the rest of the world, and thus we're just as polarized as the rest of the world. When we decide that we're going to really look towards elements of our faith to move forward in new, refreshing, novel ways, we'll have something to offer the rest of the world. Until we do that, we ain't got anything to offer the rest of the world that they can't find themselves.
1, 0, 0,
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. The world can be a confusing place to live in, and so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our chaotic world, so that you can face the chaos of the world with wisdom, integrity, and courage. One of the most confusing aspects of our culture today, and something that we all are facing in one way or another, is the conversation over racial relationships, the relationships between racial groups in our society, over racism and the various ways that it might manifest itself in our culture today. It's a contentious conversation. It's a conversation that often brings up a lot of polarization. And one of the biggest driving forces behind really this whole conversation, including the polarization, is this view of anti-racism. One of the biggest voices behind the anti-racism movement today is a guy named Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote the book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. He has a center set up at Boston University and has a very, very broad amount of influence in our society today. I'm sure that many of you guys have already heard of him and are maybe somewhat familiar with his work. But thinkers and authors and speakers like Kendi or DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, have a lot of influence, not just in our culture today, but also in the church. There's a lot of different people who have spoken out and offered some critiques of these ideas. One of my favorite people who has brought up some really insightful, thoughtful critiques is a scholar named George Yancey. And on this episode of Filter, I'm really excited to bring you guys a conversation that I got to have with George Yancey about some of these ideas. We got to talk about Ibram X. Kendi and his ideas about anti-racism, some of the danger and the problem of these ideas. We also got to go into white fragility and the issues around DiAngelo's book and the philosophy of white fragility. Yancey helps us to see how these ideas, both anti-racism and white fragility, can actually bring about a lot more harm than they can good. George Yancey is a scholar on race and religion in America. He holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Texas, and he began his career studying interracial relationships and multi-ethnic churches. Since 2019, he has been at Baylor University working on a joint appointment in sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies. He's the author of several books, including So Many Christians, So Few Lions, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and his forthcoming title, Beyond Racial Division, a Unifying Alternative to Colorblindness and Antiracism. I really enjoyed this conversation that I got to have, and I can't wait for you guys to check it out. Before you do that, would you make sure to like this video if you're watching this on YouTube, or to leave us a rating and review if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening to it. Make sure you subscribe to the show so that you can get updates and be notified every time we release new episodes. That way you'll never miss anything that we put out. Well, I'm just really excited to bring you guys this episode and this conversation that I got to have with George Yancey. And so without any further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. George Yancey. Dr. Yancey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to have you here. I've been looking forward to this. I've been following you on social media for a while and on your blog, and have just really enjoyed and been challenged by, learned a lot from your writings and ideas. And so I've been looking forward to this, and I'm just really excited that we're going to have the opportunity to have a conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. And so we are talking today about one of your latest blogs that you wrote over at Patheos on It is called The Dangerous World of Kendi's Antiracism. Now, this isn't exactly the first time that you've interacted with these ideas, because you've, as you mentioned in the article, it's sort of a series that you've done now. But just to give people a little bit of a background, if they're not familiar with you and your work yet, why do you feel a certain attraction to writing about these topics, or what is it that got you into engaging with the ideas of anti-racism, white fragility, and so on?
Yeah, excuse me. It's sort of been a journey for me, because I did a lot of writing on this about 15, 20 years ago. In fact, I had a couple of books come out, and one of them has regained its popularity beyond Racial Gridlock. And the events of last year sort of was used to indicate to me that I needed to jump back into this fray. I'm a race scholar. But I'm interested in finding solutions, not just documenting the problem, which of course we need to do. But I fear that that's all we ever do is document the problem. We don't look for creative solutions, and so that's part of what I want to do is look for creative solutions. As far as critiquing Kendi and DiAngelo, I'm more of wanting to offer a solution than critique. Unfortunately, to get to the solution, you have to critique what's already out there. And those are the two most popular books on anti-racism out there right now. So, yeah, you could go into the academic world and critique anti-racism academic level, and all of 10 people will read you. But I think that, to understand how people are using these ideas and why I think the way they're being used actually make things worse, not better, you have to go to the more popular. I know these two people are professors, but you have to go to the more popular things people are reading out there on it. And so that's why I've chosen to do that. Don't expect me to do a whole series of critiques on anti-racism books. I don't have the time for that. I'm reading a lot of them right now in preparation for my own book, but I'm not going to dive into each single one. I think those are the two most popular ones. Those are the ones that had to be challenged, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right on that. I think what they're writing about certainly aren't new ideas in the academic sphere, like you said, but writing the academic sphere, you're reaching a much, much smaller audience. However, what's unique about DiAngelo and Kendi, along with possibly a few others we could throw in there, is that they have very effectively brought it into the popular space, which shows itself through their book sales, media appearances, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, they have their books was 1 and 2 on Amazon. I don't know about New York Times bestseller, but 1 and 2 on Amazon for quite a period of time. And it's part of it is it's written in an accessible manner, and part of it is just came at the right time that people really want to try to find solutions. Maybe like I was really trying to figure out solutions, although my solutions were more developed than a lot of individuals. And so it just came at the right time. People were grasping on something, and you know how things, they just sort of snowball. And so they've been very popular books.
Yeah. And so before we get into any of the specific criticisms that you write about in this article, just to give people an understanding, let's just talk about, first of all, what is, broadly speaking, what is anti-racism? I know you wrote how there are different strands of it. It's not necessarily a monolithic set of thought, but as best you can, if you broadly explained anti-racism, what is it?
There are different ways of looking at it, and any definition I give, someone's going to say, well, I'm an anti-racist, that doesn't describe me. So I think that my best way to find out what it is to read multiple anti-racists and see what strands tend to hold them together, even acknowledging that there could be someone out there who says, well, I'm an anti-racist, that doesn't hold me. And I really come with 3 major principles from doing that. And the first is that racism is systematic and it's multifaceted, and it's just incorporated to our society. The degree to which it's incorporated may vary from anti-racist to anti-racist, but all of them talk about how racism is not just an individual thing, it's systematic, it's institutionalized, that sort of thing. Second principle that I find among most, if not all, anti-racists is that we must be very proactive in addressing and attacking it. That is not acceptable just to sit back and say, well, it's out there. And in fact, Kendi argues there's no such thing as a non-racist. Either you're an anti-racist or you're a racist.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding racist not just meaning that you hate people of color, but that you're participating in a system of racism. So it's not necessarily your intent. That's the second thing. And then the third major principle I find, and once again, it varies in ways described, but I think it's pretty clear, is that the role of whites in dealing with anti-racism is to support people of color. And I think that's a really key element because the first two, racism is more than just individualistic and that we should address it. I could go along with that. The third one, I think, is the problem. The third one is that if you really read between the lines, is whites are not equals in dealing with anti-racism. Either because whites have been the beneficiaries of anti-racism and that they need to be held back, or because, that they don't fully understand it for whatever reason, whites are not the equals in dealing with anti-racism. Their role is to support people of color in their struggle in dealing with anti-racism. And I think that is the tenet of anti-racism that's problematic.
Yeah, interesting. Those are really salient thoughts right there. Very, very good. And so there are different strands. There's DiAngelo and whoever else. But what you argue in this article is you wrote, and while a lot of attention has deservedly gone to criticizing DiAngelo's ideas, I have concluded that the biggest threat to potential future racial peace is Kendi's assertions about what we must do to become an anti-racist society. So why is Kendi's anti-racism the biggest threat to racial peace in your mind?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one is social position, another is ideology. DiAngelo, and I don't want to read intentions into this, but I don't see DiAngelo trying to lead a revolution. She's pushing out certain ideas. I think they're toxic in nature, but she's pushing out certain ideas and she's pushing them out. Kendi, I think wants to lead a revolution. I mean, you read his book, he talks about how anti-racism can basically save the world as an anti-racist society. Furthermore, he's not just writing and talking, he's organizing. Recently, he got $10 million from some CEO from a social media company. I forget the name of the person now. Escapes me. And so Kendi has a Center for Anti-Racism at Boston University. You get $10 million from one source like that, you can get a lot of money from other people because you can just go and say, hey, look, this person gave me $10 million. What are you going to do? I've learned enough this is how this works. Mm-hmm. So he can raise, I would say, almost unlimited funding. That's probably a little unfair, but a lot of money.
Yeah.
Has an organization. He's not just written his one book. He's written, other books, and not just books for adults. He's written books on how to do devotionals, in a sense, or journaling on anti-racism. Books for kids on anti-racism. His ideas, his social position, due to his own efforts, I think, is much bigger than DiAngelo's, ultimately, even though DiAngelo's probably selling a few more books. So there's that. He's going to have a bigger impact for a long period of time. He's going to eventually gain more followers than DiAngelo, I believe. But then the ideas of Kendi. I think DiAngelo, at her worst, is going to poison relationships with some people adapting her ideas and trying to implement them and make things bad in that way. Kendi is more activistic, and he wants to change our society and change our government. And for me, the most dangerous idea he has, which I'm surprised he's not gotten a lot more pushback on, is this Department of Anti-Racism. Mm-hmm. Now, I know he can't actually do it, but he's going to push for it. And what this Department of Anti-Racism would be this government agency that has jurisdiction, federal, state, local, to alter any laws that deemed as racist. Now, before you say, well, that sounds pretty good, if someone tries to pass a law outlining interracial marriage, I want that law thrown out. Me too. I'm interracially married. But his definition of anti-racism is much more expansive than that. Read his book. Read his book on how to be anti-racist. He talks about anti-racist capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So to be anti-racist is to be anti-capitalistic. He talks about anti-racism in gender roles and sexuality roles. So to be anti-racist is to be against these things as well. He even talks about, if you're not willing to engage in dealing with global warming, because global warming affects the non-white global South more than the white global South, then that's racist. To be anti-racist is to deal with global warming. Now, I'm not saying any of these things are wrong. All these things are wrong. They're controversial, and it's not a given that they're automatically right. So this Department of Anti-Racism, in theory, could not just speak to laws that directly impact on what we think about racism, but on global warming, on capitalism, on gender, on sexuality. It is, I would say, in essence, a Supreme Court controlled by anti-racists to go in and change laws as they want, as they see fit. That's an incredibly dangerous idea. And no, he's not going to get that. But this is the goal that he, with his organization in power, is shooting at. And a lot of people are going to go along this goal. And that's going to bring a lot of racial strife in our society. So this is why I think Kendi is more dangerous than DiAngelo.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I think that the Department of Anti-Racism, especially as you pointed out, I think rightly, is a very, very frightening idea. It sounds like, hello, fascism, anybody, Yeah. And that you point out in the article that in the way that he proposes it, it would be a department with no oversight. With no
oversight,
with no appointees.
No appointees. The appointees are people who are trained in anti-racism. Mm-hmm. So the appointees are people that obviously, So there's no chance of a future administration saying, "Look, you've gone too far. I'm gonna start putting people in there who's going to rein you back." They cannot be reined back. Mm-hmm. If he got his true department. Yeah,
and then, unlike the Supreme Court, which, there's some checks and balances there because the justices do have to go through somewhat of a appointment process. They interpret laws according to their constitutionality, whereas what the Department of Anti-Racism would do would be evaluating laws and so on, and how acceptable or unacceptable they are to Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah, or someone similar to his ideas. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which probably be someone influenced by Kendi. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, is it a power grab? Absolutely, and that power grab is part of what makes it very dangerous.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that, like you said, the possibility that a Department of Anti-Racism would actually be established is pretty unlikely. I agree with that. What I see or consider being much more likely is that it is, unofficially established just by the popularity of these ideas taking off with different people who are working in the various, bureaucratic offices and departments of the government, and then leaders in existing departments already starting to, run their department, whether it's the Department of Education, Transportation, whatever else, as if it is a Department of Anti-Racism.
Yeah, I think that's much more likely. Obviously, my fear is not we're going to have a Department of Anti-Racism 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or ever, because of all the barriers you have to go. I mean, you literally need a constitutional amendment in order to establish this. Mm-hmm. But he is influencing people to think along these lines think about what it takes to say, look, I need a department that forces laws that I believe are right on, at the state, federal, local level. So you're not getting away from this if you're local, down, state, federal, local level. That's our mentality then, people will bring into the decisions they make in other parts of the government, in other ways in which they, perhaps in the ways in which they run their companies. And so there could, what I fear more than the national department being established, which we agree is not going to happen, is an attitude of this is morally right. If you don't do this, you're morally wrong. You're, in a sense, maybe even evil. even though Kendi does not use those terms, but I think that would be the natural evolution of his ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I'm totally justified doing whatever I can to stop you and to implement what I believe is morally right.
Yeah.
And that sort of attitude is much more likely to develop and have all sorts of repercussions in our society.
Yeah. Yeah. You also explained how one of the dangers of Kendi's thought and approach is that he actually finds it acceptable to practice racial discrimination if it's according to his rules, and how something like this department would have full license to be able to practice racial discrimination, primarily against whites in the name of anti-racism. And I think, you already saw a glimpse of that in whenever the COVID vaccines first started coming out, and you had different people across the country suggesting that they were going to prioritize people of color in receiving the vaccines first. No why? No good reason, really, other than in the name of equity or anti-racism.
Yeah. Kendi does say that discrimination is acceptable if you're trying to overturn racism discrimination. And I think you bring up an interesting example. Now, let's just put on the table. For whatever reason, I'm not studied the literature to know exactly why this is. People of color, blacks and Hispanics, are getting COVID vaccines at lower rates than whites. There's no doubt about that. And so to say we need to look into why that is the case and how we correct that is totally appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found inappropriate, and I say this having an elderly white mother-in-law and was concerned that she got vaccinated as soon as possible, is to say, all right, we're going to vaccinate healthy people of color in lieu of unhealthy white folks, which would, in my opinion, guarantee the death of some whites at the expense of someone who could have gone without a vaccination for a period of time. To me, that's very different from saying, why are we having these discrepancies? Is it internally within the culture of colors that those people are withdrawing from the vaccination? Are there systems that are not making it as accessible to them as whites? Very legitimate question. In fact, I would want to know the answer to that question. As opposed to saying, okay, to make things equal, we know there's two populations, healthy people of color, whites who are not healthy. We're going to get the vaccination of healthy people of color more than whites are unhealthy, even though the result is going to be more than we're going to die off because we want, in a sense of equality. To me, that's totally unacceptable, rather than looking at the larger, more important issue.
Yeah. But in Kendi's thought, that would be acceptable and even justified.
It could be. I can't put words exactly.
Well, sure.
It could be acceptable.
Yeah.
I don't know in this particular situation. I don't know if he said anything about this particular situation. But here's the danger. All right, let's say Kendi would say, no, that's not what I mean. I think someone could take his ideas and come to that conclusion. So even if he doesn't intend to say, okay, unhealthy white people, you can die. Even if he said, no, that's not where I'm going. I think someone saying that because his argument that discrimination could be justifiable, to correct inequities. There is an inequity right now. Someone could put those two together and make that argument. And it wouldn't be out of the range of what he is saying. Now you have to be careful of saying that because sometimes people go with crazy ideas with one person's argument. And if we limit our arguments to things that no one could take and twist into something weird, we never argue anything. But to me, that is acceptable way of applying Kendi in this particular situation. Even if he doesn't agree with it in that situation, maybe he does. Even if he doesn't agree with that, that's perfectly acceptable because he says discrimination is acceptable in order to correct, and that there is no such thing as a non-racist. So we can't look at this as a non-racist approach. So those are some of the problems with Kendi. Yeah.
What he's suggesting appears to be a gigantic shift in the way that people in America, I think, used to think about what it meant to fight racism. Before, and you've already brought this up, there was either someone was a racist or did or said something which was racist, or there was not being a racist. And then you brought up, well, Kendi already says, nope, that's not how it works. You're either racist or you're an anti-racist. There's no non-racism. And how fighting racism used to mean that we treat everyone equally, that we treat everyone with dignity, that if there are barriers to holding someone back, well, then we work on, removing those barriers so that they get equal opportunity. But now in anti-racism, it seems that they are going much further than that, than just saying that we ought to treat everyone equally. It seems that in some circumstances, they say we ought to treat people differently, unequally.
I think that's the third tenet. Yeah, I think that's the third tenet of anti-racism. I think it's the one that many people are not going to want to admit. But if you look at the writings of anti-racists, now Kendi will say that blacks can be racist. Kendi will argue that blacks can be racist. It can be racist if you do not follow or support the ideas that he says to tear down racism. And so for Kendi, the role of whites is to support his idea of anti-racism developed in the black community. Not to bring in your own ideas, but here's the ideas that are there. It looks differently with different individuals. There was one person, I just read his book, he talked about why I don't talk about two white people anymore. And the role of whites, and he says this in the book, so I'm not, implying, he actually says this, the role of whites is to fund people of color and support them, and then talk to other whites about being, about their anti-racism. And that's their role. Their role is not to participate in thinking on how we're going to move ahead. And you can see this from time to time. Be the bridge. We know from, it's pretty public that they have rules for whites. And whites are not allowed to challenge people of color and be the bridge in the same way that people of color are allowed to challenge whites. So conversation becomes pretty stilted under these sort of conditions. And you can go down and look at other anti-racists and the role of whites. And it varies. So it's not, so you can't say that it's the same for all of them, except what does appear to be a common thread is that the role of whites is never to participate in a conversation with people of color on how to solve racial problem, is to support their ideas, is to give them funding, to help them feel better in DiAngelo's world, but not to participate in the conversation. And that is lacking in anti-racism literature.
Yeah. So back to that shift and how I think Americans are starting to view what it means to be racist and to fight racism, which Kendi and DiAngelo, the anti-racist movement, has largely effectuated. What is it in their worldview that, if you can, having studied their writings, if you can point it out, what is it that's in their worldview that's caused and changed this shift to go from saying that, there's no such thing as being a non-racist, you're either racist or anti-racist. Being an anti-racist means doing many things which would have been considered discriminatory, or unequal in the way that we used to consider fighting racism. So if you can point out, what is it in the worldview of anti-racism that has caused this shift?
See, I don't think these ideas are new. I think you could find these ideas 20, 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. In more academic literature and more of the discussion in scholarly faculty lounges, perhaps, that sort of stuff. I think what's changed is that society has changed to be more accommodating those ideas due to some of the racism, some of the horrible racism we saw last year. And because of that, people are saying, okay, what I got to do is stop it. And they're open to these sort of ideas. But these ideas are I've not gone into, I guess if you want to look at some of the work of, for example, some of the Black theology work to some degree, if you want to look at some of the emergence of critical race theory and you could get some of these ideas from that. So you could find these ideas for quite a while. Mm-hmm. The way they frame it may be a little bit new, but the ultimate core of their ideas is DiAngelo and Kendi and some of the other anti-racism is not that new.
Yeah. So back to the article, another point that I found really interesting, and you already brought this up, but I wanted to circle back to it. You wrote, to be an anti-racist, in Kendi's definition, is not merely about having the right ideas about racial issues, but it is also having the right ideas about gender, sexuality, our economy, our space, among other areas of our lives. So why does Kendi's anti-racism include these other areas and categories like gender, sexuality, and economics? I think for a lot of people, myself included, it's a little mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Why are these in the same realm? In other words, what's the connection?
Well, what Kendi argues is that anything that creates differences between the racial groups, that's racism. So it's not just if you intend to do it; it's just if you also, and this is an argument that's very old and well established, and I agree to some degree that there are institutions. Well, I agree that there are institutions that create racism and create these differences. So anything that creates differences is a problem with racism. And so, honestly, as far as things, gender and sexuality, I'm not so sure how he rationalizes it. I gave you one example on global warming, on an issue that we normally would not think of. Oh, this is about racism. The case is, yes, it is about racism, because when you look at global warming, you're hurting non-whites more than whites. Capitalism. Kendi would argue that capitalism hurts marginalized people in general, including marginalized white people, who may benefit from racism, but capitalism hurts them, but it hurts worse people of color. So since capitalism hurts people of color worse than it hurts whites, then it too is racism. So that's how Kendi gets to make this argument that racism is not just things that we find directly impacting racism. Like you can make an argument about, voting rights, the way we do voting rights. Well, that directly on racism, you can agree, disagree, fine. But things such as capitalism, global warming, he's made some connections with gender and sexuality as far as racism. Probably he would argue that people of color, the women of color, and sexual minorities of color face worse problems than others. And so so when you hear those folks, you're hurting those people more. And that's how he could get this expansive definition of racism that can pervade almost all the elements of areas of our lives.
Yeah. But at the same time, one of your critiques, and being a scholar yourself, is that they, and by they I mean Kendi and DiAngelo, very often don't provide the data or evidence behind the different arguments that they propose. And so I know that's true. You said in this article for the solutions they provide, that they don't provide any evidence that their solutions can actually work. Does the same thing apply to this as well? Do they provide evidence?
Absolutely. Kendi provides no evidence that if we do what he does, he says for us to do, it'll get us anywhere. And the reason why he doesn't provide any evidence is the evidence isn't out there. In fact, the evidence is the other way around. And, it's not that this is something that's brand new. People haven't been trying it. And now we haven't gathered evidence. Diversity training and this sort of programs, whether it's been called anti-racism or something in the past, that's been done. This has been done for decades now. And the research has indicated that it does not make things better. And in many ways, it can make things worse. So, and this is something that I really find in a lot of the anti-racism stuff that I read is no one provides evidence that this actually works. Or maybe there's some limited evidence that's in certain ways that they may be provided that I'm missing. But they're not providing evidence that actually works. And so we're going to embark on what I think is a dangerous journey without being able to rely on evidence and say, hey, we have reason to believe that this is actually going to work. And we don't. And I think that's problematic.
Mm-hmm. Isn't there actually evidence, even if it's not a great amount of evidence, that evidence to the contrary, that these ideas, in fact, don't work, and they bring about more negative results than positive?
Yeah, there is. There's a study out there that shows that when you talk about privilege, that actually what happens is that people have developed more animosity towards whites, but their attitude towards blacks doesn't change. So talking about privilege actually just creates higher levels of animosity. There's sorry, there's evidence out there, research, not just anecdotal evidence, research out there showing that when you introduce diversity training, that a lot of times what it creates a backlash, hostility towards it, and it also creates feelings that, okay, we got diversity training, so we've solved the problem of racism in our company. We don't have to do anything else. There's research that shows that diversity training in corporations, and you look at them 5 years later, they actually have less people of color working in management positions than they did when you first have it.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's evidence that this doesn't work. Can you find some small studies that show that, hey, we had some success here? Yes, you can. But then what we call meta-analysis, which is looking at multiple studies, has shown that when it comes to long-term effects, diversity training does not create long-term tolerance. So if we want something that we know that's science-based, that we have confidence could work, this is not the way to go.
Yeah, one thing that makes me think about is Shelby Steele's book on white guilt. And he argues that many of the efforts to combat racism or to do diversity training and whatever else don't actually serve the improvement of racial relationships, certainly don't add to the improvement of Black lives, but really all they do is help white companies and white institutions prove that they're not racist.
Yeah, I've not read that book completely, but I came to the same conclusion as to why people are doing anti-racism, why companies are doing anti-racism. Because if you're accused of racism, and remember, racism can be a very expansive accusation. So you don't have to prove that someone is personally racist, although you probably find that in a company large enough. Then what you do is you hire an anti-racism trainer and you bring the programs in there. And even though the programs don't do anything, you now have probably legal cover and some degree of social cover that you're a company doing good things. And as a result of this, I don't know if you know this, but every year companies spend $8 billion on diversity training.
Wow.
Now, I can't say all of that is anti-racism, all right? So I don't know what percentage that is anti-racism, what percentage is not. But I'd be willing to bet a good chunk of my next year's salary that more than half of it is based on anti-racism. Given the attitude towards anti-racism today, I would bet that a good chunk of it is. But yeah, so companies are spending money for image maintenance for programs that don't work.
Wow. It makes me think of the Roman Catholic practice during the Reformation of purchasing indulgences. You know, you have your sins, and so you purchase an indulgence from Robin DiAngelo that absolves you from that sin.
It's also why efforts towards anti-racism can get a lot of financial support. Because what can show you that, hey, we're not really racist, than to give $10 million to a Center for Anti-Racism.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it works or not is irrelevant. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't matter whether or not anti-racism programs work from the point of view of these companies, since it gives them cover. Now, if something actually does work, will they take it? That's a good question.
Yeah. So on Robin DiAngelo, you've written another article criticizing the concept of, in her book, white fragility. What are your critiques of white fragility?
Well, white fragility, is a concept that the reason why white act the way they do, their defensiveness, which inhibits us being able to deal with racism, is due to this some unique phenomenon called white fragility. Okay, as an academic, she relies heavily on what we call implicit bias studies, which they're not always that reliable. There's probably something there, but we don't know what it is. And people have tried to link implicit bias to prejudice have been unable to do that. So when DiAngelo argues that we're gonna, you may have implicit bias that has this hidden prejudice, that goes without any sort of real research backing that up. Okay, so that's one problem of it. The other problem is if there's white privilege, is this unique to whites? Is there any research out there that shows that whites are defensive in ways that people of color are not? No, there's no research out there on that. So she's coined a concept that's devoid of any empirical assessment, any empirical support. Now, I can coin a concept, orange monkeys, has no empirical support. And I can say, hey, let's believe in orange monkeys. And people can laugh at me and no empirical support. But that's not doing any damage. White fragility, I think, is doing damage. Because what it does is it shuts down conversations. According to DiAngelo, if you're white, what can you do? Can you protest? No, that's white fragility. Can you be mad? No, that's white fragility. Can you cry? No, that's white fragility. Can you justify yourself? No, that's white fragility. The only thing you can do is be totally 100% supportive of what people of color say. Now, I don't know whether you're married or not. If you are looking for a relationship where the person you're married to is 100% supportive of everything you say, I'm not saying support in general. Of course, we want people to support in general, and as a person of color, I want people to support in general. Mm-hmm. But whatever utterance comes out, you have to support it. Just think of how huge my head would grow, how huge your head would grow, how huge anyone's head would grow. It's not healthy for people of color to have white fragility around. It's not healthy for whites to not be able to express their own frustrations. In theory, and I'm not saying DiAngelo would support this, but this, once it gets back to, in theory, if this fits in with your framework, even though you don't support it, you have to account for that. And there are ways she can account for that, but she doesn't. In theory, if a black man at a company made a sexually suggestive comment to a white woman, could she protest? In theory, maybe not. Because he could come back and say, that's your white fragility. You see me as a black man, as a sexual creature. Your white fragility is coming out. And what can she say in DiAngelo's framework? DiAngelo does not even bother to say, well, there can be abuses. And here are some abusive situations which you're allowed to speak out. She doesn't provide whites with even that. So why could that not be acceptable in DiAngelo's framework? It can. If she wants to come out and say, all right, here's some exceptions, then I will accept that and say, okay, I can't use that as an example any longer. But until she does that, that is a perfectly legitimate application of white fragility. So, I think it's a horrendous idea for race relations and can be misused. And undoubtedly has been misused in conversations today.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I know that she says, I know that in her training seminars that she does, some of the rules that she sets out is that white women are not allowed to cry, because she argues that the tears of white women are traumatic for people of color.
Right.
And was specifically, I think the way that she backs up that argument is by bringing up examples from the era of slavery and Jim Crow,
sure. Yeah,
where a white woman might have made some kind of a accusation that she was mistreated or assaulted or whatever else by a black man.
That absolutely happened there.
And those things happen. Yeah,
and I'll even go say is it probably still happens today that that there are white women making false accusations against people of color. And using their tears to put in a person of color. We know that there's cases of an African American. Well, there's this football player who's in jail for 6 years. I forget his name now. And a white woman made a false accusation, and her tears put him in jail. I mean, yeah, that's true. That's not a blanket condemnation of all tears that a white woman may want to shed. The fact that some white women have abused that and misused that, is clearly the case. Mm-hmm. That does not mean that it cannot be appropriate for a white woman to shed tears for a situation for how she deals with it. And so, we could take anything and say, this has been misused in this circumstance, therefore, you ever use this again. And that would be crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that one of the greatest dangers and harms of white fragility is the harm that it does to interpersonal relationships. And as you've already stated before, and as I know I've read it in other places, how people report after going through these seminars or experiencing some of these ideas, they find themselves less willing to have some of these conversations, less willing to engage in conversations across racial lines, whether it be or about racism, because they feel like they're going to be considered guilty the moment they step into the conversation.
Yeah.
And I was talking to somebody yesterday, a mature, godly Christian man who said that he was seeing that within himself, how he was pulling back from having these conversations because he had experienced some specific circumstances of being called a racist simply for having a difference of opinion and ideas. And then that's led him now to, saying that he felt suspicious and nervous to even engage into these conversations because he was afraid that he was going to be called a racist. And I know I've talked to several other people who feel the same way.
Yeah, I've had people approach me and say similar things. Is that and these are people who want to deal with racism. This is not people who want to ignore racism. Mm-hmm. And I'm critical of what I call a colorblind perspective. People who say there's no problems. Let's just ignore the problems that are out there and ignore racial differences. So I'm critical of that, no doubt. And I want my white brothers and sisters to work with me to deal with racism. I want them to understand some of the frustrations I have and to move together. I absolutely want that. But having said that, I totally understand the white person who says, I'm not going to talk about racism because I can't win. If I make any sort of disagreement, I'm a racist. The only thing I can do is agree. If I don't agree, then it eats me up inside to say I agree with something I don't agree with. I can't win. I care about racism. But if this is what you're going to ask of me, you can count me out. I know that because I know there are certain situations where I feel, not on race. I think I'm probably immune on racial issues for a variety of reasons. But other situations where I go, you know what? If I'm not allowed to be honest, then I'm just going to pull out of this conversation and I'm just going to put my energy somewhere else. And so I think this is one of the costs of anti-racism. The stifling the conversation actually pushes people away. And while it's popular today, at some point that is going to fall apart. But not before it's going to bring a lot of people into conflict, and not before it creates a lot of racial alienation. And alienation, I think, is going to survive beyond the survival of the framework of anti-racism.
Well, as you've already said before, along with this alienation, how polarized we are over these ideas right now regarding regarding just race and racism in general. We've become even more polarized due to these ideas and in our country today. And one thing that's really bothered me that I was wanting to get your insight on is how, to me, it seems as though the church is equally as polarized as the broader culture in the world today. If you go onto the various blogosphere of the Christian world, if you go onto Twitter and see the conversations among some of the, I guess, leading Christian thinkers right now, there is just as much polarization, alienation among Christians and the church as in the world. We don't seem to have it any more together on these issues. We don't seem to have a stronger unity or answer for these issues than the world does. And that really bothers me. And I wonder why. Why is that? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think what the church has done is they've adopted the ideas out of the world. And some people out of the world are saying, ignore race, just, be colorblind. And some Christians adopted that idea. Others are saying anti-racism is the way to go, adopt that. And some people are adopting that idea. And then we come to church and we are just as contentious as the rest of the world. what I think the church has not done is ask the hard question: what is about our Christian faith that would give us a different answer than we're seeing out the rest of the world? Or does our Christian faith give us a different answer? Is there something about our Christian faith that could give us insight that others are lacking? And we don't ask those hard questions, and therefore we adopt the answers of the rest of the world, and thus we're just as polarized as the rest of the world. When we decide that we're going to really look towards elements of our faith to move forward in new, refreshing, novel ways, we'll have something to offer the rest of the world. Until we do that, we ain't got anything to offer the rest of the world that they can't find themselves.
That's great. And so what opportunities do you see for the church to engage in our culture today? Like, do you see any specific areas related to this conversation where the church has an opportunity to really present a witness that we have not been taking advantage of, whether because, we've just been blind to it or we've just been too disunified to see it?
Glad you asked, because I'm working on a book on that, which should come out in February from University, called Beyond Racial Division. My basic idea is this. I think that one of the key philosophical or theological, however you want to put it, difference between Christianity and at least secular ideologies, whether it's different from other religions, is debatable, is the whole idea of human depravity. That we are fallen creatures. As fallen creatures, we tend to find solutions that meet our needs, but not necessarily the needs of everyone else. And so we need accountability. We want to operate out of our own group interests and not necessarily concentrate on the interests of other folks. And for me, the way we get that here on Earth is through having what I would call collaborative conversations with one another, where we talk for purposes, for goal-oriented purposes. We listen for understanding. We don't engage in conflict for the sake of conflict. And then we try to find solutions that everyone can live with, rather than solutions that's for our team. I think this is an idea that we can push. It's an idea that's supported by research. It's an idea that I think is supported theologically, because what differentiates, I think, Christianity from, say, humanism, because both of them would say humans are great. Humans would say humans are great because we're rational and we're perfectible. Christians say humans are great because we're made in the image of God. So we're not different in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Where we are different is that humanism would say we're perfectible, we're moving towards perfection. Christians say we're great, but we also have human depravity within us. If we're not careful, that can overwhelm us and create awful systems. Understanding that and holding each other in check through these conversations, which I'll talk about in the book, is, I think, a Christian way in which we can offer something that's not being seen out in the rest of the world.
That's great. And I'm looking forward to that book. It sounds like it's going to be incredibly helpful and insightful. One thing that in talking about creating these collaborative conversations to move forward and just in this whole conversation over racism in society, one question that I often have is what are the goalposts? What are the outcomes and things that we should be striving for? In other words, when do we know that we're achieving whatever it is that we're going for? Because I think that everyone, especially in this conversation over anti-racism, is giving different visions of when are we finally achieving the society that we ought to have when it comes to racial relationships. Is it economic equity, or is it hitting the diversity quotas in our universities and corporations, or is it something related to crime and policing? What, as Christians, with discernment from what we're hearing the anti-racist group say the goalpost is, what should be our goalpost? How do we know when we're starting to reach the future that we ought to be striving for?
Here's how I would argue that. I would argue that we've reached it under what I propose when our society stigmatizes people who refuse to engage in the conversation as much as they today stigmatize people who engage in racism. That today is totally unacceptable to engage in racism. Now, doesn't mean people don't do it, but I'm just saying that if you do so, people are going to stigmatize you. They're going to look down upon you. And unless people think that, well, of course, that was not the case 30 years ago, 40 years ago. If you engage in racism, and people will accept it. They may not like it, but they will accept it. Today, it's just not acceptable. When we reach the point, if you all know what my goalposts are, which probably won't happen in my lifetime, hopefully in my son's lifetime, we reach the point in our society to where people refusal to engage in a cloud conversation is stigmatized as much as the refusal to renounce racism today is. We have reached it because by that point, we will engage in so many collaborative conversations that we will really have found solutions that people can live with, instead of solutions that our group benefits from at the expense of others.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, this has been a really great conversation. I've enjoyed it. You've really given me a lot of helpful insight to Kendi, DiAngelo, the anti-racism issue, as well as the Christian response. So thanks a lot for joining us for this episode today. Do you want to tell people where they can find more of your work, how they can support your work, and get connected with you?
Sure. I have a website, georgeyancey.com. It's all one word, George Yancey, Y-N-C-E-Y, not C-Y, C-E-Y. Mm-hmm. That goes to a different George Yancey. And you can see some of my books there. And of course, the new one comes up in February. I'll put that into that website. You can also find me. I work at Baylor University. So if you want to Google Baylor and George Yancey, that'll come up too. So those are a couple of ways in which you can find me. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, like I said at the beginning of the show, I've been following you for a while and have really benefited and learned a lot from your work and writing. So I hope that our listeners go and dig in more into what you said, because I think the ideas that you've been writing on, your criticisms as well as your positive contributions and suggestions are really important for us to start implementing and learning. Because they're based in a Christian worldview, first and foremost. But then you also have your expertise and scholarship to go along with it, which is really helpful. So once again, Dr. Yancey, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Filter.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch up with the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the